Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is an introduction to engineering ethics. In every field of engineering, bad decisions have hurt people. Aerospace, we can all think about the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding on launch, killing 7, or the later Space Shuttle Columbia exploding on re-entry, killing another 7. Biomedical, there was a famous example in, I want to say, the 50s of a heart valve that was built with welds that could fail, in which case hundreds of patients who had these heart valves died from these kinds of failures. Chemical, there was a famous example not too long ago of a South Asian chemical plant leaking a toxic chemical cloud that killed thousands of nearby residents. Those of us who live in the Houston, Texas area can remember slightly less deadly, but certainly just as dangerous and harmful for the people who did die. Explosions at a plant from British Petroleum, a chemical plant that leaked a chemical cloud into, a burning chemical cloud into the sky for several days in the last 2 summers ago or so. The chemical industry has lots of these on its conscience. Civil engineering, the elaborate flood prevention system that had been built for New Orleans failed during Hurricane Katrina, flooding New Orleans and displacing tens of thousands. Electrical, we may all remember the not too long ago case of a Samsung cell phone battery that would catch fire, sometimes wounding unsuspecting cell phone users. And in the mechanical petroleum world, there was the Deepwater Horizon oil well that blew out, killing workers on the platform and spilling oil on half the U.S. Gulf Coast. The aerospace one, I want to say the Space Shuttle Challenger one was certainly more dramatic, but there also have been several cases of airplanes such as the Boeing 737 MAX that crashed. The 737 MAX crashed on takeoff in a couple of cases because of bad guidance system design. So, which falls not just in aerospace but also in software engineering. So, all of your different engineering fields have some case you can point to back in not too distant time, where a bad decision, a decision to cut a corner somewhere or take the easier way or the cheaper way, hurt people. Bad engineering decisions that were not always so obvious. Let's say that you're an engineer for a company that makes a battery-powered product, and you've narrowed it down to 2 choices. Battery A lasts 12 hours on a full charge. Battery B lasts 16 hours on a full charge, and they cost about the same. You would naturally want to choose battery B, wouldn't you? Your customers would prefer to have a longer charge. But someone in your company points out that battery A is made in the USA under strict OSHA supervision of work conditions. The people who make it are paid union wages and benefits, and the EPA supervises the ecological impacts. So, for less charge, fewer hours of charge, you're treating your workers better and treating the environment better, because battery B is made in a South Asian country by a company that employs preteen workers in sweatshop conditions for very low wages and has a terrible environmental record. So you're hurting people and you're polluting the environment for 30% more uh, battery charge. Suddenly, the choice is not so obvious. Um, the other problem, though, is that engineering decisions are not always black or white. The way I framed this, you could buy battery A or you could buy battery B, but uh, there's always another choice. You could develop another battery in-house and set up all the contracting to make it and produce it, and not have to deal with another company. You could work with company A, who has all of these good work conditions and uh, ecological conditions and all of that, and see if they can make a battery that lasts, say, 14 or 15 hours on a full charge. In which case you've got the best of both worlds. Or you could invest a little bit in company B to upgrade their workshop conditions and their environmental impact. So there are a lot of ways that you could uh, make an impact on this situation other than simply choosing A or B. What do these situations all have in common? Difficult decisions had to be made by engineers and or their managers. Usually and. Engineers are rarely allowed to make decisions in a vacuum. They have management who comes in and interferes in some way or another. But the management usually won't make a design choice and just leave the engineers out of it either. So a good ethical engineer has a lot to do with making the world a better place. The decisions that were made affected people's lives. It's not making too fine a point, I think, to say that engineering is one of the few technical fields where what you do has a very direct impact on other people's lives. There are other technical fields like chemistry or particle physics where you're dealing purely in theory, but engineers do things that affect lives. And these decisions really needed ethical guidance. And that's what the rest of this presentation is going to be about, is what kind of thinking is ethical thinking. Okay, so we're going to cover some general ideas about ethics, and then in the next presentation, after this one, we'll talk about ethical principles for engineers, and throughout the whole thing, we'll pepper in some examples of ethical decision making. So, what are some reasons why we might choose to do something? You certainly can probably come up with your own, but here's a list of a few that tend to come up in my classes. It helps us or is in our best interest, okay? Rarely am I going to choose to do something that's not at all in my best interest, because even if I'm doing it because my boss says so, keeping my job is in my best interest. But the more that something helps me directly, the more that it's in my best interest, the more I might really actively choose to support that course of action. It helps other people. If I'm an altruistically minded person, and I hope that all of you who are getting into engineering want to help other people at least in some way, then it certainly motivates me to do something if I know that it's going to be of help to other people. Certainly I wouldn't have gotten into community college teaching if I didn't feel like it would help you, my students, acquire, career skills, but also become, better, more rounded people. It helps the earth. Okay, increasingly, part of our altruistic thinking and our self-interested thinking is a realization that the earth is fragile and that we humans do things that impact it. Climate change is the most obvious one that springs to mind today, but in previous generations, the most obvious environmental concern was pesticides killing uh, birds, and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Or there have been many examples of cases where engineers have needed to change their practices to help the Earth. It makes us money, okay? Let's be frank. I'm not one of those people who believes that money makes the world go round, but I also have 4 children to feed, so I'm not going to turn down an opportunity to make a little bit of money on something that I have the opportunity to do. Our employer told us to. Okay, that goes back to my comment at the beginning on keeping my job is in my own best interest. If my boss told me to prepare a particular report, all other things being equal, I'm going to prepare that report because that's my job. The law or the government tells us to. It's kind of sad that these other helping other people and helping the Earth don't add up to make us do good things all the time, but sometimes the government needs to tell us that there's a particular safety standard that our airplane needs to live up to, or a particular pollution standard that our chemical plant has to live up to. Our religion, our philosophy, our political party, other belief systems that we may have tells us to do it. I happen to be Jewish, and Judaism has an awful lot to say on matters of ethics, books and books of things to say. I political party-wise happen to be a Democrat, and that affects some other things. Though really it doesn't affect my engineering or my teaching at all. I have other belief systems about what I believe is the best way to teach that makes me make certain decisions about how I structure this class, for example. That belief system happens to be informed by what other people have taught me about research into learning and teaching and all of that. But to some extent, it boils down to what I believe works, what I have observed works in my classes. It seems like it would be fun to do. You know, it's been said that the road to hell is paved with the phrase, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but that doesn't mean that it's always bad to do fun things. Nobody goes out tubing on the Guadalupe River because it helps other people or it makes them money. They do it because it seems like it would be a fun way to spend a summer afternoon. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly good thing to do. So which of these are moral or ethical reasons? I would indicate that helping other people, helping the Earth, are the most ethical reasons on here. Okay, that we do things because we want something to benefit other people or the Earth. There are some forms of ethics that say helping yourself, doing what's in your best interest, is a moral or ethical thing, but it doesn't quite fit the definition of ethics that we're using in this class. There are some forms of ethics that say following the law and what the government tells us is ethical. But again, that doesn't quite follow the definition of ethics that we're using in this class. Um, we would hope that our religion or philosophy would be interested in ethics. And so that's a little bit closer to what is in this class. Um, I'm not circling political party because I know that um, all the political parties in this country have had their turns of doing unethical things on occasion to try to get their way. And uh, well, there is that wonderful saying, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." That doesn't necessarily mean it's the ethical thing to do. Okay. What are some reasons we might choose not to do something? This is perhaps just as important for understanding ethics is understanding reasons to not do something. Um, it is unfair or unjust. Um, a lot of people use these two words as synonyms, but they're not exactly the same. To be unfair usually means that you're not treating two people the same way. Um, that if two students turned in uh, identical copies of a homework exam or homework problem, and I gave one of them a 0 for cheating, but I gave the other one full credit, that would be unfair. I'm not treating those two people the same way. Um, if I gave one person longer on an assignment because I know that they got sick or they had a family member who got sick, um, and I made everybody else turn the assignment in on Wednesday, but I gave that person till Friday, that is technically unfair. I am not treating that person the same way as the rest of the class, but it is just. I have a just reason for treating that person differently. And so uh, there is fairness and there is justice, and um, sometimes the two line up nicely. That the just thing is also the fair thing, but sometimes um, we can have a justified reason to be a little unfair, to give one person a little bit of slack that we don't give everybody. It's inconsistent with what people expect from our actions in the past. Um, there was a famous British playwright, I forget what his name was off the top of my head, who said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And it is true that being consistent is not necessarily always the best thing to be. If you have been a racist in the past, you don't want to be racist now just to be consistent. On the other hand, if you've always given $15 to your local charity every month, that kind of consistency is good. It lets the charity expect that they're going to get some money, and it helps other people for you to give that money in a consistent way. So sometimes being consistent is good. And as an engineer, if you consistently deliver the same quality of product, that's a good thing. So suddenly delivering a poorer quality product would be inconsistent with what people expect of you, and that's a reason not to cut corners on a particular order or design or something. It's not in the best interest of the people it affects. So this is kind of the opposite, the flip side of the coin of we do something to help people, we would not do something that would harm people. It would make us look bad. Okay. Hate to think that the world turns on reputation, but sometimes it does. And your company doesn't want to put out a battery that explodes when you try to charge it, because that would make them look bad. Um, or damage their reputation. Um, in that case, it would also harm people, it would not be in the best interest of the people it affects. But even if you put out something that didn't harm people, but just it breaks after a month of use, that would make your company look bad or damage your reputation. It would damage our environment. Again, that's the flip side of the coin of we choose to do things that help the earth. We choose not to do things that would damage the environment. It's against our stated policies. This kind of goes with that being inconsistent or consistent thing. But sometimes it's just a matter of your company has a policy that you don't do X, and so we don't do it. And if you disagree with that, you have to work on changing the company policy, not just break the rules and hope you don't get caught. It's against the law. That's an even more strong case of you don't just go break the rules and hope you don't get caught. If you think the law is wrong, you should work on changing the law. Use your vote, use your influence with politicians in Austin or Washington. If nobody's listening, you can try to get some people together to sign a petition, hold a protest rally, whatever. But you have to change the law. You can't just, as an engineer, go break it. It's not in our own best interests, okay? Sometimes there is a good reason to go against your own best interest. But in most cases, if it hurts you, there's not much sense in doing it. It's against our religion, our philosophy, our politics, or some other system of beliefs. So, again, some of us stick very closely to a religious way of thinking or a philosophical way of thinking that has some ethical precepts to it, and we wouldn't go around breaking those rules willy-nilly. Or perhaps we have another system of beliefs like, I believe it is wrong to give tests to my students unannounced, okay? That's a personal belief. It's not written in stone. It's not even a company policy. It's just a system of beliefs. So which of these are moral or ethical reasons? Certainly fairness and justice have an ethical element to them. Sometimes consistency has an ethical element to it if you're being consistently ethical. Again, if you've been unethical in the past, you wouldn't want to keep being unethical just to be consistent. The people it affects, that's an ethical thing. Damaging our reputation, that's a little sketchier. Though in most cases, people give you props for doing the ethical thing, and what damages your reputation tends to be cutting corners or breaking rules or things like that. Damage our environment, that's certainly an ethical consideration. We're thinking about the world around us and our legacy for the future. Against the law, again, this can be ethical if the law is ethical. We can all think about times in our country's history where we've had laws that were unethical. Jim Crow laws, for example. So being against the law does not automatically make something an ethical or unethical situation. And again, we would hope that our religion or our philosophy has ethics at its heart, but that's not a guarantee either. So we've been talking about whether certain ideas are ethical or not. I'd like to ask the question, what makes a principle or a rule one of those things that makes us decide to do something or not to do something? What makes it an ethical reason? First, the idea must be of supreme or overriding importance to a group. Okay. For example, thou shalt not kill is of pretty serious importance to any society that doesn't want to deal with loss of life every time somebody gets mad. Uh, as unfortunately we've been seeing at the edges of our society in the last year or so. But it doesn't have to be of overriding importance to uh, all of society. You could have pursuit of accurate scientific knowledge be an ethical principle for a research team, which would lose funding and reputation if, not to mention just their own pride in their work, if they stopped trying to pursue accurate scientific knowledge. The idea has to be universal, which means it has to treat all similar cases in the same way. Everything that falls under this umbrella must have the same ethical value and the same ethical treatment. For example, it would be unethical to give different participants in a medical study different amounts of patient education, because the ethic of informed consent applies universally, that all patients should get the same basic level of medical education, of patient education about what they're getting into. You can't say, oh, well, this person's kind of too dumb to understand, I'm not going to give them the whole speech. That would be unethical, because it's not treating that person the same way that you treat all the other patients. This would also apply to how engineering companies treat their customers. It is not uncommon for engineering companies to build up a special relationship with one or two particular customers who have been customers so long that if they ask for special treatment with an order, free rush shipping or priority over other projects in your design pipeline or whatever, that the company might want to give them that privilege. But that would not be an ethical way to treat all of your customers. Okay. Now, if you had a general rule that your ethical rule was the longer you've been our customer, the more special treatment you get, I suppose that would be treating all similar cases the same way. But that's a pretty screwed up way of thinking about ethics. The more ethical idea would be to say that we apply the same standard for prioritizing projects in our project pipeline for all of our customers, because somebody who just came along and found us has the same right to our design expertise and the same should be able to expect the same kind of treatment as somebody who's been a customer for 20 years. That's not to say that that's the only way to handle the situation, but that's sort of the ethical way of looking at it. The idea must account for the welfare of others, or perhaps even of all. So an example of something that doesn't account for the welfare of others is if I keep a personal journal. Okay, I don't. I've tried several times, but I can't form the habit. But if I did, I wouldn't want to lie in my personal journal, because I'd hate to go back in 20 years and read what I was thinking today and know that I had lied to myself. But that's a personal preference. That's not a moral or ethical judgment. I can lie in my personal journal. I can say that I danced with fairies on a rainbow today and it doesn't hurt anybody. That's not an ethical decision. But if I'm keeping a work journal, that is my laboratory's record of my experiments or of my design work, and that journal has the purpose of informing others about my work, lying in that journal would be unethical, because now I'm endangering the welfare of others, other people in my company who want to know about my work, other people in the world who would benefit from or be harmed by my work if it wasn't, checked out reasonably by a coworker or something like that. So that's the three ideas if we want to say, is my thought an ethical one? Am I thinking about a group? Am I thinking about a universal principle that applies to a lot of cases in the same way? And am I thinking about the welfare of others? So deciding, where to go on my family vacation would be of overriding importance to my family, but probably that's not a big enough group for it to be an ethical decision. Deciding what lunch to pack for my child in the morning isn't really an ethical choice unless I'm deliberately discriminating against one of my children and saying, well, you get nasty leftovers while everybody else gets something good. So, you can think about some ideas take on an ethical circumstance when you start thinking about how they apply to others, and other ideas just seem like their personal preferences. Okay. So here I want to switch gears to talking about how ethicists think about morals and ethics, as opposed to just how us engineers kind of lazily think about it. And to the ethicist, there's a pyramid of morals and ethics. Okay, at the top of the pyramid are the most general ideas, and there are very few of these ideas, which is why it's a small triangle at the top of the pyramid, but they're all very important ideas. They cover everything. As you work your way down the pyramid, you get more and more rules to think about, and each of those rules covers a smaller set of situations. So we go from moral ethical theories, which we're only going to talk about 2 of, to general ethical principles, which we'll have a half dozen of, to specific ethical rules, which for engineers, there are literally hundreds of ethical rules out there. And then individual judgments and actions are where the rubber hits the road. You will make hundreds or thousands of ethical judgments in your career as an engineer and in your time as a student and all of those things. Each individual judgment you make tries to apply ethical rules and ethical principles to a specific situation. Okay. So like I said, we're only going to talk about 2 moral ethical theories here. There are more than 2 out there, but these 2 serve as a nice pairing that play off each other. One of them is called utilitarianism, and the other is called common or universal morality. Utilitarianism, if we were to state it formally in ethical language, we'd say an action is right if it produces the greatest value or the least disvalue for all who are affected by the action. The greatest good or the least harm that comes of it. This is the form of ethics that is often shorthanded as the ends justify the means. That is, it doesn't matter how you get there. What matters is, do you do good for people or do you do harm for people? The nice thing about utilitarianism is that the best choice of action can be objectively determined. If you can predict, at least, how much good and how much harm is going to be done to people, you can calculate which of 2 choices of action is the more ethical one. I have a bridge to build, and if I put it in spot A, I have to kick 10 people out of their homes to build it, but it helps 1,000 people get to work every morning. If I put it in place B, I have to put 20 people out of their homes, but it helps 2,000 people get to work every morning. Well, you can calculate, depending on how you want to do it, that one of them helps more people and the other one harms fewer people, and we can balance that out and see how we want to do the ethical calculus there. In utilitarianism, the ethical value of the end result is the only thing that is important. Okay, so if we need to make shady backroom deals to get our bridge built, as long as it ends up helping those thousands of people get to work in the morning, it's okay. Some of you might be a little uncomfortable with that. Well, how can it be ethical to do something unethical, like make a money under the table backroom kind of deal? Well, for you, there's another ethical theory to consider, and that is the common or universal morality approach. That is, an action is right or wrong because of the moral value of the action itself. And how do we determine the moral value of the action? We look at values that are held universally, or at least generally in common by our society. Our society generally believes that giving somebody a bribe to get your bridge permit is an immoral thing to do. So we would consider that an unethical action according to the common morality. What this means is the best choice of action has to be subjectively determined. We have to think about what choices we make. We have to think about the moral value of choices we make, and that means we have to have guiding principles to go by. What guiding principles do we use? Do we look at Judeo-Christian ethics? Is there even such a thing as Judeo-Christian ethics? Because we have this famous saying in Judaism that 2 Jews equals 3 opinions. If you look at the amount to which Christianity has splintered over the years, surely you can find 2 Christians who disagree on what Christian ethics is as well. Certainly, this year's election is showing us that what our country's sense of what is morally right and wrong is splits 40% one way, 40% the other way, and 20% sitting on the fence in the middle, not really sure what to do. If it's even that much, maybe 45, 45, and 10% in the middle. I'm not sure. But we're a very split society at this point. So finding a common universal morality is difficult, to say the least. Which is why there is still an attraction to utilitarianism, where we can sort of objectively determine what is right and what is wrong. Okay. Now, in thinking about utilitarianism versus common morality, this is where we often get those really ridiculous situations where a trolley is heading off the tracks, and if you throw the switch one way, you save 100 people, but if you throw the switch the other way, those 100 people die, but one special needs child is saved, or something, where you have to think about the moral value of this life versus that life, or, all this crazy stuff. We're not going to do that in this class. You can thank me later. Okay. What we are going to talk about is a couple of situations that really do come up. So let's say a patient has a terminal illness. There's only a 30% chance that your best treatment will cure the illness. But patient confidence has been shown to improve results of the treatment. So you tell Donald Trump that there's a 100% chance that he'll get better if you give him the treatment. Okay. And he brags about it to everybody on public television. Utilitarianism says that's okay. Lie to the patient. Tell them the chances of success are fantastic because their optimism will lead to a better treatment outcome and greater happiness while they're taking the treatment. So why not? The outcome is better. Common morality, however, is generally most Americans are pretty uncomfortable with lying, especially with a doctor lying to a patient. That situation is very clearly one where the doctor has a moral duty to tell the truth. So, also lying to the patient keeps them from making an informed decision, which is another societal value that we have in Western society, is that each patient deserves to make a choice about their treatment based on the best information at hand. So, let's say we have a patient who is dying of cancer. You've tried regular chemo and it didn't work. There's an experimental new treatment, but only 3 out of 10 patients really benefit from this. But there's this placebo effect that if you believe the treatment is going to work for you, it has a better chance of working. So the utilitarian way says, sure, lie to the patient, tell them there's a 50% chance. The common morality thing says, no. The moral thing, the ethical thing, is to tell the patient the truth so that they can make their best decision. What about engineering? Okay. You have an idea for a product that will improve many people's lives. Your employer does not like to start new products. You happen to work for a company that's kind of an old fuddy-duddy. They like working on their existing product lines. And you happen to have found a competitor. Maybe you met them at a business lunch or something, who heard about your idea and would love to pay you kind of under the table. Nobody has to know. And they will get your product to market in less than a year. Well, the utilitarian way says, your employer isn't going to do anything with it, so you're not really hurting your employer. The product's going to improve many people's lives, so it's good to get it out there. It's going to profit the company that buys it from you, and it's going to profit you by putting some extra money in your bank account. So other than the fact that the company you work for misses out on an idea that they probably wouldn't work on anyway, go for it. Common morality says shady deals are bad. You have a moral obligation to be loyal to your employer because loyalty is one of our American values. Your employer has supported you for many years. You've got a legal obligation. You're on a contract. And if you tell your employer and they refuse to use your idea, then you can still work through above board channels, get a GoFundMe going or something like that to find a market for your invention. So this is where in my live class I would ask how many of you feel utilitarian about these two situations. How many of you would be okay with lying to the patient and taking the under the table money to have happier outcomes, versus how many of you are more the common morality type that you just can't stand the doctor lying to the patient and you just can't stand the employee lying to their company and being disloyal. It's not a cut and dry decision, and that's one of the reasons why we don't usually deal with moral ethical theories in everyday practice. We want to have more concrete rules to work from, ethical principles, we call them. So, finishing up this presentation, which has gone on for a little while now, I want to give you a couple of test cases to think about as you try to think about what are some standard engineering ethical principles that we can devise to work from. Civil engineering case. A local township wants to put in a system of levees, reservoirs, drainage, bayous. Obviously, I'm thinking in a Southeast Texas frame of mind here, that would prevent houses from flooding when the next hurricane hits. Your engineering firm is asked to certify the city engineer's plans. You notice that the planned system would work fine for what they call the 100-year floodplain, but a flood of, say, Hurricane Harvey proportions, what they call a 500-year flood, would still overflow the levees and many houses would be flooded. That said, the civil engineering plans are solid, and your company, who wants to keep the city's business, wants you to sign off on the plans. Loyalty to your company being a value, that would indicate that should be what you do, is just sign off on the plans. But a local citizens group is asking you to make a public statement criticizing the plans and explain that you have noticed that those plans do not go far enough to protect local homes, given that more and bigger storms are expected in the next decade. So what's the ethical thing to do? Loyalty to your company, keeping in mind the good of the citizens, loyalty to your client, the city itself. What's the engineering ethical principle that should apply here? Chemical engineering. A new process for making your plant's signature chemical product would save your company 10% a year in production costs. That's quite a bit more profit for your company. So loyalty to your company, again, would indicate that you'd want to do that. However, the new process would require dumping 20% more of a pollutant into your local drainage stream, when you've already been criticized by local environmental groups for being right at the legal limit. Your employer, however, is sneaky, and they know that the pollution standards, the legal limits, are written as parts per million. So if you just dilute your waste stream, you can put 20% more pollutant and 20% more water into the waste at the same time and stay legal. You're still polluting the local bay 20% more than you had before, but you're not exceeding the legal limits. The local citizens group, however, is knocking on your door, noting that fish and wildlife are already showing signs of getting sick at the current waste levels in the bay. What's the ethical thing to do? Again, this time you have loyalty to local citizens, to the environment. You have the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. You've got local environmental groups versus loyalty to your company. You've got a lot of competing interests here, so we need an ethical rule to follow. What would that be? Okay, and as we think about this, before I get into the next hour on engineering ethics, or ethics specifically for engineers, I want you to think about your personal morality, your set of standards of conduct or rules to live by. We all have some sort of rules to live by, some sort of personal ethical conduct. There are things that we just won't do, okay? Lines that we feel like we won't cross. And we also have things that we think are gray areas, okay? We have, most of us at least, have some things that we think are always right, some things that we think are always wrong, and a lot of things that we think fall into these gray areas. We form these rules by watching parents, religious leaders, school teachers, role models, and heroes in our lives. Um, and at some point, we come to our own moral ethical reasoning. We start thinking, um, hopefully as educated people, but also as people with a moral ethical sense of our own. So your homework is to write your own list of between 5 and 10 moral ethical principles that you intend to live by as a working engineer. And you're going to present them to the class, and we're going to see how much each of you is an independent thinker, ethically speaking, and how much we see some overlap between what we think. If we can distill from your presentation some general principles that we feel like all engineers ought to live by. Okay, that rounds that off. Good luck with your ethics, and I look forward to seeing them in a little bit.